Dear friends, subscribe and hit the bell. Your support allows us to continue our investigations. April 28, 1953, the Moscow region. A gloomy sky hangs over the government dacha, like the lead lid of a coffin. The air is saturated with dampness and anxiety, which seems palpable to the taste. Metallic, cold. Black cars pull up to the gates. Men in military uniform emerge from them, but without the usual reverence with which they had looked at the owner of this house just a month ago. The owner, Vasily Yosifovich Stalin, Lieutenant General of Aviation, commander of the Air Force of the Moscow Military District, son of the man whose name made half the globe tremble. But now, on this gray April day, the magic of the surname no longer works. It is turned from a shield into a target. Vasily meets his guests not in a ceremonial uniform, glittering with golden awards, but in his home clothes, tired, with a puffy face marked by sleepless nights and endless libations of recent weeks. He knows why they have come. His eyes show not fear, but rather a gloomy acceptance of the inevitable. Only yesterday he was a Red Prince, Lord of the Moscow sky and patron of sports, and today he becomes a state criminal. The arrest warrant is signed by those who, not long ago, swore eternal friendship to his father. The doors slam shut, the engine roars, and the car drives him away from his accustomed life, away from freedom, into a long corridor of oblivion. Thus begins the fall of the Falcon, whose wings were clipped not by enemies in an aerial battle, but by the silence of offices and the weight of his own legacy. To understand how this brilliant officer ended up in the back of a prison car, one must rewind the tape of time, back to the beginning, where a character woven from contradictions was formed. Vasily was born in March 1921, at the height of the formation of the new state. His childhood was spent in the Kremlin, but these ancient walls were not a cozy home, but a golden cage. From an early age, he saw people around him clothed in power, heard conversations on which the fates of millions depended, but was deprived of the most important thing: simple parental warmth. A key moment that fractured little Vasily's world was the death of his mother, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. He was only 11 years old. This event became a tectonic shift, forever changing the emotional landscape of the family. His father, Joseph Stalin, after the tragedy, withdrew into himself, turned into a monument, into a function, distancing himself from his children with an impenetrable wall of state affairs and personal pain. Vasily was left alone with the Kremlin guard, governesses, and special service personnel. His educators became men in uniform whose task was not to love, but to guard and report. The head of security, Nikolai Vlasic, became closer to the boy than his own father, which created a distorted perception of the world. Power and strength replaced love, and obedience replaced respect. In this vacuum, a rebellious spirit was formed. Vasily grew up mischievous, uncontrollable, greedy for life and impressions. He quickly realized that his surname was a universal key to all doors, but at the same time, a curse. At school, teachers were afraid to give him bad grades. Classmates either flattered him or avoided him. He desperately sought an area where he could be himself, where the result would depend on his personal qualities, not on who his father was. And he found this area in the sky. Aviation in the 30s was not just a branch of the military, it was a religion, a symbol of progress and courage. Pilots were new icons, and Vasily decided to become one of them. Admission to the Kachin Military Aviation School was his first step toward independence. Here, amidst the roar of engines and the smell of aviation kerosene, he felt alive. The instructors, of course, knew whom they were training and tried to create special conditions for Cadet Stalin. But Vasily, to his credit, often rejected privileges, demanding to be treated like everyone else. He truly loved to fly. The sky was the only place where he didn't feel the pressure of the Kremlin walls. In the cockpit of a fighter, he was just a pilot whose life depended on reaction, skill, and knowledge of technology. However, his father's shadow covered even the airfields. He was not allowed to fly as much as he wanted. He was protected like a precious state resource, which drove him mad. When the Great Patriotic War began, Vasily was only 20 years old. He yearned for the front from the very first days, bombarded his father with letters, begged to be released to the active army. But Joseph Stalin held back. Only in 1942 did Vasily get his way. And here begins the first layer of his complex drama, the layer of external conflict, where he tried to prove his worth as a warrior. Contrary to popular myths, Vasily Stalin was not a parade general who sat out in rear headquarters. He truly fought. He made 26 combat sorties and personally shot down several enemy aircraft, according to various sources, from 2 to 5. Those who flew wing to wing with him remembered him as a brave, sometimes even reckless pilot. He didn't hide behind his wingmen, often leading groups into attack himself. His bravery was genuine, but it always contained an element of fatalism, as if he sought in battle not so much victory as atonement for his privileged position. Vasily's career ascent was meteoric, even by wartime standards. A colonel at 21, a major general of aviation at 25. Such a dizzying rise caused envy and gossip. Whispers circulated that stars fell onto his epaulets directly from the Kremlin table. This was only partly true. His father did indeed monitor his progress, but often also hindered him, delivering harsh reprimands for the slightest misdeeds. There were instances when, for disciplinary violations, for example, for a foolish fishing trip using aviation rockets, which led to a tragedy, Vasily was removed from his post and demoted. These swings, from favorite to outcast, kept him in a constant state of nervous tension. After the war, Vasily headed the Air Force of the Moscow Military District. This was the peak of his power. He gained control of enormous resources and used them with the extravagance characteristic of his nature. It was during this period that his organizational talent, but also his demons, were revealed. Vasily became the main patron of Soviet sports. He created Air Force sports teams: hockey, football, basketball, volleyball. He gathered the best athletes from all over the country, offering them conditions that could only be dreamed of in other societies: apartments, officer ranks, high salaries. The construction of the sports complex on Leningradsky Prospect, the creation of the country's first 50-meter indoor swimming pool. These were all his projects. He burned with passion for it. He lived for the successes of his teams. Athletes adored him for his generosity and accessibility, but feared his wrath. He could give an apartment for a scored goal and send someone to the guardhouse for a lost match. This was feudal governance, where everything depended on the mood of the suzerain. Vasily tried to create his empire within his father's empire, a small state where he would be the sole master, where he would be loved not for his surname, but for what he gave people. However, behind the facade of the brilliant general and sports patron lay a second, darker layer of conflict, an internal one. Vasily Stalin was slowly but surely losing the war against himself. Alcohol became his constant companion during the war years, and in peacetime, it turned into the only means of anesthesia against spiritual emptiness and fear. He drank a lot, often, and indiscriminately. A retinue formed around him, those friends who poured wine and laughed at his jokes, but in reality used his proximity to supreme power to solve their self-serving issues. This entourage played a fateful role. They created an informational cocoon around Vasily, isolating him from reality. They whispered to him that he was a genius, that everyone loved him, encouraging his worst inclinations. Vasily, being by nature a suspicious and insecure person, easily fell for this flattery. Deep down, he understood the value of this friendship, but loneliness was scarier. He once, in a drunken revelation, uttered a phrase that became prophetic. "As long as my father is alive, I am alive. If he is gone, they will tear me to pieces." He lived with the feeling of a sword of Damocles hanging over his head. His relationship with his father was a complex knot of love, fear, and alienation. Joseph Stalin was a deity to him, an unattainable ideal. Vasily tried to live up to it but failed every time. His father was an ascetic. His son loved luxury. His father was a man of iron discipline. His son was the embodiment of chaos. Every meeting with his father was an exam that Vasily failed. Letters have been preserved where the aviation general apologizes to the leader like a misbehaving schoolboy. This constant pressure broke his psyche. Vasily tried to drown out the voice of insecurity with the roar of engines, the shouts of the stands, and the clinking of glasses. Here we move to the third, ideological layer of the tragedy. The story of Vasily Stalin is an illustration of the paradox of dynastic power in a system that officially denied monarchy. In the Soviet Union, there could be no crown princes, but in fact, there were. Vasily found himself a hostage of the system created by his father. He had no right to a private life, to mistakes, to choose his own destiny. He was state property. The ideological conflict was that he possessed all the attributes of power, but did not possess power itself. His influence was illusory. It rested solely on biological kinship. The system, built on a rigid hierarchy and fear, did not tolerate uncontrolled elements, and Vasily was precisely such an element. His behavior, his drunken antics, his independence, even if imagined, irritated the party elite. Beria, Malenkov, Bulganin, Khrushchev, they all saw him as a threat, not as a political competitor. Vasily had no talents as a statesman, but as a symbol around which the discontented, or those nostalgic for a strong hand, could rally after the leader's departure. Moreover, Vasily knew too much. He saw the behind-the-scenes of the Kremlin, knew the weaknesses and vices of his father's associates. He was a living witness who was becoming dangerous. As long as Joseph Stalin was alive, no one dared to touch his son. But the flywheel of intrigues was already spinning. The first warning signs appeared in the early 50s. The plane crash with the Air Force hockey team in 1950 near Sverdlovsk was a terrible blow. Almost the entire team died. Vasily, fearing his father's wrath, concealed the extent of the tragedy, simply recruiting new players. This act shows the fear in which he lived and the moral compromises he was willing to make just to avoid upsetting the master. But the real turning point came in the summer of 1952. During the air parade in Tushino, commanded by Vasily, there was a mishap during the landing of bombers due to a sharp deterioration in weather conditions. One aircraft crashed. Stalin was furious. He removed his son from the position of commander of the Air Force of the Moscow Military District and sent him to study at the General Staff Academy. This was a disgrace. Vasily perceived it as a catastrophe. He stopped attending classes, locked himself in his dacha, and fell into a heavy drinking binge. He felt that the end was near. The transformation of reality occurred in early March 1953. The news of the illness and then the end of Joseph Stalin's life became a signal for the beginning of the end for Vasily. In those days, he behaved inappropriately. Arriving at the near dacha, where the dying leader lay, he, being intoxicated, loudly shouted at the doctors and his father's associates, "You destroyed him! You eliminated him!" These words, thrown in the face of people who were already dividing power, became his sentence. He violated the main rule of the game. He voiced what everyone thought but kept silent about. Immediately after the funeral, where Vasily was merely a shadow, a lost and crushed man, the new government began to act. He was offered to leave Moscow, to take command of a remote district. This was an honorable exile, a chance to preserve freedom and life in exchange for silence and disappearance from the political radar. But Vasily, driven by pride, resentment, and alcohol fumes, refused. He did not believe that they could treat him, the son of the leader himself, harshly. He threatened to appeal to foreign correspondents to tell the truth about his father's demise. This was suicidal bravado. On March 26th, he was discharged into the reserve without the right to wear a military uniform, a humiliating blow for a combat general. And a month later, on April 28th, they came for him. The arrest became the culmination of his downfall. The accusations were absurd and terrible at the same time. Embezzlement of state funds, which was true given his spending on sports, abuse of power, and, most importantly, anti-Soviet propaganda. The investigators, who just yesterday had saluted him, now methodically broke his will. In the dungeons of Lefortovo and Vladimir Central, the most tragic period of his life began. Vasily, accustomed to comfort and permissiveness, found himself in a stone bag. He was stripped of his name. In the documents, he was listed as Vasily Pavlovich Vasilyev. This was the erasure of personality, the transformation of a person into a number. Years of imprisonment undermined his already weak health. His problems with his legs, blood vessels, and stomach worsened. But the most terrible thing was the lack of information. He wrote letters to Khrushchev, Voroshilov, begged for an investigation, swore allegiance to the party, reminded them of his military merits. But the letters remained unanswered. The new government wanted him to be forgotten. In prison, Vasily underwent a torturous transformation. From a spoiled prince, he turned into a martyr for his family name. He thought a lot, analyzed why everything happened the way it did. He had time to reevaluate his life, his relationship with his father, his mistakes. It is said that in prison he became a turner, and this simple physical labor gave him some solace. He learned to live as an ordinary person, deprived of privileges, and this was, perhaps, the most important lesson he learned too late. In January 1960, he was unexpectedly released. Khrushchev, feeling confident enough, decided to show humanity. Vasily was brought to the Kremlin for an audience with the first secretary. The meeting was strange. Khrushchev cried, recalled Joseph Vissarionovich, promised Vasily to restore his rank, pension, apartment. It seemed the nightmare was over. Vasily was given a 3-room apartment on Frunzenskaya embankment, and his general's uniform was returned, but without the right to wear it. However, this thaw was short-lived. Vasily could not adapt to the new reality. He started drinking again, dubious characters, _quote_2_, eager to see a living legend, gravitated towards him. But most importantly, he couldn't keep silent. He continued to talk about his father being removed, visited the Chinese embassy. At that time, relations with China were deteriorating, which was regarded as political unreliability. The authorities realized Vasily Stalin was uncontrollable and dangerous as a symbol. 3 months later, in April 1960, he was arrested again, this time for continuing anti-Soviet activities. He was returned to Lefortovo, and then a final decision was made to exile him from Moscow to Kazan, a city closed to foreigners. He was forbidden to use the surname Stalin. The passport issued to him before his exile bore the surname Jugashvili. This was the final blow to his identity. He fought for the right to remain Stalin, but the system deprived him even of that. Kazan became the place of his end. He lived in a one-room apartment on the outskirts, in house number 105 on Gagarin Street. The 5th floor, modest furnishings, loneliness. Nurse Maria Newsberg came to him, becoming his last wife, but many researchers believe she was assigned to him by the KGB for control. Vasily was fading. His body, worn out by alcohol and prison, was failing. He walked with a cane, looked like a deep old man, although he was only 40 years old. On March 19, 1962, Vasily Jugashvili's heart stopped. The official cause was acute heart failure against the background of alcohol intoxication. But around his death, as around his whole life, rumors swirled. It was said that he was, quote, 5, that he knew too much and talked too much. However, there is no evidence of this. Most likely, he simply burned out, exhausting his life's resources in a mad race with his own destiny. He was buried in the Arsko Cemetery in Kazan, modestly, without military honors, without a salute, without speeches. A simple monument stood on his grave with the inscription, "To the Only One." Only many years later, already in New Russia, his ashes would be reburied in Moscow, next to his last wife, and the prosecutor's office would drop all charges against him, recognizing them as politically motivated. The story of Vasily Stalin resonates even today, because it is not just the biography of a dictator's son. It is a universal tragedy of a man crushed by the millstones of great history. It is a lesson in how destructive boundless power can be for those in its epicenter. Privileges that seemed a gift turned into poison. The surname that opened doors became a prison bolt. We see in his fate the eternal story of the prodigal son who never found his way home, of talent that existed but could not be fully realized due to the lack of inner core and external freedom. Vasily was an excellent pilot. Even his enemies admitted it. He was a talented organizer. Soviet sports owe their post-war surge to him. But he was not ready for the burden that fate placed upon him. His life shows us the flip side of the golden age of the empire. We see not the grand facades of Stalinist high-rises, but the broken fates of those who lived inside these high-rises. This is a reminder that a totalitarian system devours not only its enemies, but also its children. No one is immune. No one's safety is guaranteed, even if your father is the leader of nations. Ultimately, Vasily Stalin remains a tragic and sympathetic figure. Not as a political figure, but as a man. He was a quote two who wanted to fly, feel the wind in his face, and be first. But the sky he loved so much turned out to be too high, and the earth too harsh. Closing the circle of our narrative, we return to that April day of '53. As the car took Vasily away from the dacha, he might have looked out the window at the pines passing by, the same pines under which he played as a child, under which his father walked. Now they were just trees, indifferent witnesses to his fall. He was leaving for the unknown, leaving behind the glitter of generals' epaulets, the roar of the stands, and the illusion of omnipotence. Ahead was only silence, broken only by the beating of his own heart and the echo of the surname that became his destiny and his sentence. The story of the Golden Boy ended, leaving us only yellowed photographs and eternal questions about the price of power and the fragility of human life in the face of a ruthless state machine.